This is Eric Pepke for Dead Man Video, and there's no VU meter, so I hope this is working. This video ends with what may very well be the only instance where truth has ever mattered in a federal courtroom. It's certainly the first one I've experienced, and I know you're thinking this is completely impossible. Well, admittedly, it doesn't matter much, but it's kind of a symbolic and very Pyrrhic vindication. That's a good word. So I'm just going to tell about this, my experience with the polygraph. Now, if anybody ever watched any of the videos on my channel, which they don't, they would know that I was put into supervised release for the rest of my life on February something or other. And this has been very aggravating, extremely not happy making for little Eric. And the first thing that happened when I met my supervised release officer was he gave me a stack of papers. Now, he seems a very reasonable guy and kind of hands-off, but the papers were kind of alarming because one of them was ostensibly an entire sexual history that I had to fill out, and it came from a thing that said Polygraph on it. It was from a company, and the questions were just terrible. They were real, when are you going to stop beating your wife stuff? And that's not an exaggeration. In fact, it's probably, I'm probably not stating how horrible the questions they were, but they were interrogatory and prosecutorial and prejudicial and complex and entirely not like any honest person who spoke English would want to do, let alone a psychometrician. So I didn't feel so good about that. Now, as part of the requirements, first I had to go to First Step, and First Step is a drug and alcohol place. Well, none of that applies to me, but they have their procedures, and I had to go there. And there was a counselor, and I said, yeah, none of this applies to me. She says, okay, and said, well, if you want to treat me for something, probably PTSD would be a good start. And I just really need somebody to rant at and listen, which obviously doesn't happen here. And so she said, you know, I'd be perfectly willing to sit down and let you do it. And she stage whispered to me, and the federal government will pay for it, which is great because for the rest of my life, I'm going to try to cost the federal government as much as I possibly can. And I have no moral qualms about that whatsoever. So I liked her, and so I've been coming back, but I only get to see her once every month. I also had to go through the forensic treatment at another facility, which happens to be in the same building, with a completely different staff. And so I did the first interview over the phone. And they said, okay, that sounds cool. We're probably not going to recommend you for treatment. There's a firefighting type place where they have a building they burn right next door, and so that happens. So anyway, that was all right. He says, well, we're going to have to make you take a test. And I'm thinking, oh, it's going to be like that one. But I was able to do that over the phone with another person, and it was perfectly fine. It was 300 questions. Sure, it was intrusive, but I pretty much published my entire sexual history online. I don't care about that, but the questions were reasonably well. They were good psychometrics. They did all the little tricks to tell if you're telling the truth by putting negatives and rephrasing the questions and yada, yada, yada. Sort of like the MMPI, except the MMPI, of course, was the granddaddy, and it's really designed to figure out how much you think like a Midwestern farmer. But anyway, I did that, and he said, yeah, no, you're not treatable. But then what happened? In the meantime, before my first pro forma session, is that the main therapist, and oh, by the way, have you noticed that therapist is the rapist if you put a space in. Anyway, they had given her a prosecutorial document, which, like all prosecutorial documents, is prejudicial and alarming, and she flipped out. It took actually 2 sessions before I got her to look a little sheepish and say, well, let's start over and I'll have an open mind. Of course, this is impossible because once you've been exposed to information that's gotten into your brain, especially with a lot of emotion, you've been thinking about it for a day or two, it becomes part of your physical wiring. And that's led to a digression that I won't make here. So that was all right. Well, not all right. Right in the sense of not at all right. And then I was scheduled for group. And so so after the second session, there's a guy waiting in the hall, and it takes a while, but we recognize each other from Petersburg prison. And she asks him to tell me what the polygraph is like. And I said, well, I'm worried that it's going to be interrogatory and present and prosecutorial and presumptive and a lot of other words beginning with P. And he's nodding his head, and he says, yeah. And I said, and he says, Bob is going to drive you crazy, and that did not make me happy at all. So later on, I had to go in for my first group session. Now, I'm not allowed to say anything about what happened in the group, but one of the guys walked me to the bus stop, and I repeated all of my concerns so that I could get clean information that I could report. And he says a lot of some stuff that I thought was questionable. He said polygraphs have improved, and I couldn't explain that it doesn't reduce the possibility of a false positive. And he said, well, Eddie is the best, and if you get Eddie, you're fine. He's a great raconteur, and he actually came here because there was a very prosecutorial, interrogatory type person, and he got him fired and took his place, and that was a couple of years ago. So, that later that day, I was to show up for my polygraph exam, and I went into the courtroom, surrendered my phone to my PO. I couldn't shake his hand because my hand was covered with ink from a pen that exploded, so I fist bumped him. We went upstairs. I put me in a conference room, which is a little bit less frightening than a courtroom anyway. And I suppose the courtrooms were probably being used for prosecuting innocent people, which is what they do. And so there's this electronic Iron Maiden sitting there, and there's a guy in the back, and he's got a bunch of computers and papers and stuff. After a while, I asked him his name because he didn't introduce himself, and he was Eddie. And he is a great raconteur. In fact, he seems very similar to me in many, many ways. And but I'm thinking the good cop thing, right? Because that's what they do. And we went through the little sheet with the terrible questions. And he seemed to understand why some of the questions were terrible. And so that was a little bit encouraging. And so he said he was going to write down what he said 3 charts, and explained that he never does more than 3 charts. He used to do 5, but what happens is that people, their arm just gets tired and they get false positives because of that. And so I said, I'm vindicated a little bit. You can get false positives from pretty much everything, anything. Now, I'm an insulin-dependent diabetic, so my blood sugar just has to vary a little bit, and I get tachycardia, and I get hyperhidrosis, and everything goes to snot. And that actually happened later on that evening. And of course, I hadn't eaten very well at breakfast because, hey, homeless shelter. And I was very stressed, and stress shuts down digestion. And so I'm thinking this is going to be a false positive. And I explain, if I get a false positive, it's going to be because I'm sitting there telling the truth. I've done my research, and most places suggest you just be completely honest. There are all these tricks, but some books say they don't work. Well, whatever. And so I figured, this is actually not going to harm me if I get a positive, because I know cannot be used against me in court, and it's not going to go through any process that will get me back in court. Furthermore, I don't care, because if I get into court, I can talk about these videos, which I'm risking re-imprisonment. I don't think they're actually going to do it, but if that does happen, then I will have proof positive that I was convicted for my political beliefs and not for anything else. I think my evidence is clear and compelling, but I would like something better. So, like beyond a reasonable doubt. Although, now I have more than that. So he straps me into the chair. Well, yeah, he puts me in the chair. I sit down. There's foot pads. There are these little bands that go around my chest and abdomen to detect breathing. And he says, don't take a deep breath, because then it will require the time for the bands to get back to homeostasis. And he actually said homeostasis, which impressed me. So I do that, and then he says, go like this, like you're flipping off a highway patrolman. And I said, well, I wouldn't do that to a highway patrolman, but I'll do it for you. I should have said Joe Biden. Honestly, think of all these things. What I should have said was Gene Shepard, whom you probably know from A Christmas Story, if you know him at all, said once, the saddest words of tongue or pen were not, it might have been there. What I should have said was, so anyway, this is for the photoplethysmograph that measures your pulse. These two fingers, which is harder than a Vulcan salute to do, they put skin galvanometers on there to detect how much you sweat. He said it also had something to do with signals from the brain, which I find frankly very hard to believe, because this is pretty far away from the brain, and there's a lot of ganglia in the spinal column and stuff like that. So how do you know it's from the brain? And so this was the photoplethysmograph. I got a sphygmomanometer. Say that 10 times fast. On this, because they said that they no longer do it here, but he said between each chart, which is a series of questions I have to answer, my hand might turn blue or red, and I should go like this and rest. So we had gone through all the questions. They seemed okay. I might have rewritten one or two, but I actually started thinking of, how can I interpret this, and how can I think of this in a way that is maximally useful to me. And I decided I was just going to tell the truth as if it applied to my entire life, unless there was one question was, since you were put on supervised, since you were released from prison, which I had to answer because it said that. But the other ones, I said, okay, so I'm just going to tell the truth. And then if I get a positive, it will necessarily mean that the entire process is fraudulent, and then I'll know. Now, the guy at the who walked me to the bus told me that Eddie will tell you right away what happened. So I really don't have to be sneaky about trying to get information about it. But okay, whatever, I did. So I went through the 3 charts, as he called them, test sessions, okay? And he asked me the questions, and I answered them, and I tried not to breathe deeply, just doing what I'm supposed to do. And At the end, he's behind me all the time, which is one of Freud's tricks. You're not in somebody's face when you're talking about stuff like this because that has an effect. So he comes out, and while I'm still strapped in, he says, "What question bothered you the most?" And my answer was, "How the hell should I know? I suppose you're going to tell me." So he took my stuff up, and he said, "Well, a pass is +3. Your score was +24. And so I'm thinking, oh my God, this is obviously a false positive. And he saw my discomfiture and said, no, 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 +3 is a pass. -3 indicates deception. In between, we have to make a judgment and maybe inconclusive. But you got a +24. 8 times the passing score. And so he went back and we were talking and he said, I would be perfectly happy with you coming over to visit me at my house. And that's probably a pro forma thing to encode how much confidence he had that I was completely innocent. But I might hit him up because I'd like to write a scientific paper jointly with him and submit it to a peer-reviewed journal, which I know the best one. And and he said, well, here's a picture of my pet bear. Apparently he lives out in the woods, and there's a bear that comes over and eats off of one of his corn feeders and sometimes comes within 30 feet, and he calls it the pet bear. And I said, well, yeah, I'd love to meet your pet bear. But I said, you fuck with people, don't you? And he got a shit-eating grin and nodded to that. So then they got my supervised release officer in. And we were talking, and he said, this is the cleanest chart, those were his words, that I have seen in 3 years. And after a while, I said, you fuck with people, in front of my SRO, and he gave like a mock okay. So it was okay. I'm well aware of the problems with polygraphs, but I passed it so spectacularly under such adverse conditions that I know that there is not a single neuron in my head that could ever have done any of the things that I was accused of, any of the illegal things. I've been accused of doing perfectly legal things, but they're perfectly legal. And this was a relief to me. And the reason is that it is because if you haven't seen anything about the Ash experiments on conformance, I suggest you look up the YouTube video. It basically what it says is that peer pressure is incredibly important. They got 5 people in a room, 4 of them lied about something, and 30% of the time, 37% of the time, the 5th guy lied as well just to fit into the group. And the 5th guy always, all of the different 5th guys gave different reasons. And when that happens, of course, even Freud knew this, none of them is the real reason. And what's really going on, I keep running out of space on this craptastic cell phone. I don't even know how or if I'm going to be able to edit it. Anyway, when people have multiple reasons and none of them are real, what's going on is really deep in your cognition at a level you can't control. Of course, the Freudian concept of the unconscious is nonsense, but most processes are unconscious or preconscious. So anyway, in a lot of situations, the peer pressure got to me. When everybody on the planet is pointing at your face and saying, Chomo, even though you know that there's nothing in your brain like that, it gets to you. It makes stuff happen. It makes you doubt. Well, I have, I think, even given even the most skeptical view of the polygraph, given all of the factors. Now, remember, this guy is older than hydrogen practically, and so he has a lot of experience reading people too. And so, that's one of the things that makes a polygraph inaccurate because the operator can override what it says on the charts. But in this case, his impression of me, which was exactly correct, was the same as the polygraph's impression of me, which was also exactly correct. And since then, I'm not going to worry about it. I don't think I have any. Now, I am utterly convinced that there are no demons in my skull at this point. And so, again, this wasn't in a courtroom, but it was in a courthouse. And I'm going to try every way I can figure out to use this information to get back into court, to get a COA. I have plenty of evidence that I'm innocent. But the problem is getting into court. And I'm going to try that. Obviously, I can't talk to the press or any actual individual people because none of them care, which is why I don't get any views. And, but still, I feel a little better. Fortunately, a couple of days after Wednesday, I saw my the good therapist, the one I'm voluntarily seeing so that I can cost the federal government money, who's a very, very nice person. She listened to the whole story. And she said, well, I'm going to use the H word. And, of course, I have no idea. And she said, happy? I said, well, happy is a very strong word, but let's just say that I am mildly pleased. And that's all I have to say.